So once again, I'm going to talk about optimizing your petrochemicals configuration. And the three topics I'm going to talk about is going to be quite complementary to what Brian took us through, is the global trend of crude to chemicals, what's driving it and what's making it significant now. Even though it's been being done at a much larger pace, it's being done for 40 years or more. I'm going to briefly go through the optimize your gas to chemicals investment, because a lot of what I was going to talk about there is the core of the technology to select in your gas phase of feed is your steam cracking solution. And I was obviously going to talk along the lines that Max did of SCORE, so I'll pick up some time there. And then finally I'll come to some revamp options, because here in the Russian Federation and in Tatarstan we have a couple of good examples of modernizing older technology with cleaner, more efficient, modern technology based on zeolite chemistry. So let's take a moment and talk a little bit about what is behind the global chemicals growth, and it is truly a mega trend. And in this chart you'll see the two graphs here. One on the left I'll focus you in on first. If you look at the dashed line marked as GDP over the time from 2000 to 2020, GDP is averaging, or expected to average, 2.8% per year annual growth. In that same period, you can see the green line on top of that. That's 4.2% worldwide growth in chemicals. And largely that's driven by the chart on the right, where I've taken a composite of polyethylene, polypropylene, and paraxylene demand as a proxy for all chemicals growth. And you can see that the real growth is coming out of China, India, and to a lesser extent, because it's off a smaller base footprint, is the Middle East and Africa. The other problem that you see on the bottom of the left chart is the fuels growth rate. Fuels are growing at a combined annual average growth rate of about 1.4%, which is about 50% of the GDP. So the old paradigm has changed. It used to be that you put in a chemical plant to take those non-value-added, non-fuels molecules and turn them into something that had more value. Now it's the other way around. We're talking about having refineries as petrochemical feedstock units. And it's all about the three drivers or themes in the bottom left: maximizing the chemical derivatives, minimizing particularly the heavy fuels, and depending on where you are around the world, to a lesser extent, more or less extent, is the wanting to use proven or demonstrated technologies to lower the risk, because these are huge, massive investments with 10 to 20 million metric tons a year of crude feedstock. Now, what's driving the chemicals growth? Well, it's clearly the growth in the global middle class, being led by India and China, both expected to add 1 billion people each to the middle class with higher disposable incomes, buying more and more of the things that are manufactured out of polymers. There is a bunch of policy initiatives, in particular areas where it becomes a national imperative to displace imports. And then the last one here is the reduced exposure to regulated fuel markets, particularly in China, where the oil price is fixed on the way in and the gate price of gasoline is fixed on the way out. Moving to chemicals gives a nice way of growing earnings power. So where are these located? So on this slide, I've just put the announced crude to chemicals complexes. The biggest one by far is the Aramco SABIC JV, and it's in detailed planning phases right now. There are two in Southeast Asia, one by Healey in Brunei and Pertamina Rosneft in Indonesia. But look at how many there are announced in China. And the top three of those are all in various stages of detailed engineering, construction, and in the case of a couple of them, starting up as we speak. So what have we got to do to maximize chemicals growth from a refinery? So this is a very simple traditional refinery configuration, probably fairly typical of what you'd find around the world as a medium conversion refinery in the mid-1970s or 1980s. It consists of various distillation, hydrocracking, hydrotreating, and has a reformer for an aromatics complex as well. And these are the typical products that you would take out of the refinery. And what you see is that 25% of the products coming out of that sort of refinery on a medium crude are typically a resid type of product. 55% or thereabouts is fuels, gasoline, diesel, and fuel oil. And then at the top 20% would be the value-added aromatics and petrochemicals complex. So to grow the capacity to make more chemicals out of the refinery is now starting to add a resid upgrading to take more of the resid up into the naphtha range, so you need to make a slightly larger FCC unit and hydrotreating, and you drive more and more of these into products for aromatics complexes. And when you stop at that point, you end up having what we call crude to PX, or crude to paraxylene. And then the next optimization, as a couple of the speakers have already talked about, is bringing in steam cracking into this integrated complex. And the final one that we talk to across the integrated crude to chemicals play is taking the UCO up to Group 1, Group 2, Group 3 plus lubricant base stocks. I'm going to come back to the chemical derivatives a bit later on in the gas to chemicals piece. So what does this look like? When you move to the intermediate case of crude to PX that I referred to, you're now producing about 40% chemicals, being aromatics and light olefins. And then when you go to the full crude to chemicals configuration that you see on the left side, you end up with about a 50-50 mix when you include the value-added lubes business. So what are the keys to crude to chemicals? Well, there's a bunch of two different keys. There's a key of optimizations. In other words, which product mix do I want to run? What fuels will I have, and how do I dispose of them at a profitable margin? What's my trade-off between complexity and flexibility and cost? And how am I going to handle resid management? And the key factors there are that whole feed product slate flexibility, the balancing between hydrogen and energy as you move hydrogen in one part of the complex and take it out in another part. How do you integrate that? What's your environmental footprint? And then obviously cost in both CapEx and OpEx. And ExxonMobil would like to present to you in these next 3 pages a couple of key technologies that we would like for people to consider. Is a carbon rejection technology for resid upgrade or resid management called flexi-coking, and a brand new to the market version of PX production called EMTAM, which stands for ExxonMobil toluene alkylation with methanol. So first let's talk about the resid management, and you've basically boiled down the choices into 2. A configuration for hydrogen addition versus a configuration for carbon rejection. The one on the left is the hydrogen addition, and you see for pretty much the same 20 million tons a year capacity that was being looked at for this case study for investment in Asia. You add the resid management to take the ebulated bed for hydrogen injection, the delayed coker, and then the partial oxidation unit. You've got to use that to sort of generate a lot more hydrogen to go back into the hydrogen addition unit. So you compare that then to the scheme on the right with the green box called flexi-coking, where you do in situ thermal cracking, in situ gasification of the coke, so there's no coke to handle, and then you generate out of that gasification a lean fuel gas that can be used to fire heaters in both the refinery and the aromatics complex. So the results of this case study were shown here on this path. In the top hexagon, you see hydrogen demand reduced by 38% across the complex by using thermal cracking, because you're not using hydrogen, that value-added molecule, in handling your resid. You take the energy balance, you improve that across the complex by 33%, largely due to the lean fuel gas that comes from the flexi-coking unit. You reduce CO2 emissions by 3.7 million tonnes a year. And all in all, that reduces operating expense by about $60 million a year, and capital expense is reduced by about $3 billion on a $15 to $18 billion base. So significant OPEX saving and significant game-changing CapEx reduction. The other case study we did for the same client was looking at integrating in this EMTAM process. As I mentioned earlier, EMTAM takes toluene from the aromatics complex and selectively puts the methyl group from the methanol in the para-selective position. So it's at least 80% selective to paraxylene, when a normal equilibrium-based process would give you 24%. So that dramatically reduces the amount of material used and recycling of material in the silene's isom loop. So gas to chemicals. This is steam cracking. You see first the ethylene train going, typical products coming up, and then in the bottom of the chart you see the major uses, not all the uses, for propylene molecules. You see the key optimizations, the key factors are somewhat similar but a lot more reduced, because the complexity is a lot simpler once you put your steam cracking unit in. And the key enabling technology that I was going to talk about, but we'll pick up some time thanks to Max's kind efforts, is the SCORE steam cracking technology and some of the advantages that it's got there. Looks like I'm jinxed because there we go. Max covered this, he covered that. And then finally, I wanted to talk about revamp opportunities in this market, particularly here in Tatarstan, but in the Russian Federation generally, is another alliance, actually a JV, called Badger Licensing. It's a joint venture between ExxonMobil and the French EPC company Technip. And it licenses both ethylbenzene and styrene monomer technologies and propylene, benzene, alkylated materials, Cumene, and phenol is most often put in with other technologies such as KBR's phenol, but Badger's technology has been put in front of every phenol production unit around the world. Badger also has bisphenol A technology, but the two in the dark blue box are zeolite-based processes that are supported out of ExxonMobil catalysts. And I'm proud to say that about 50% of the world's ethylbenzene and Cumene is manufactured in Badger processes over ExxonMobil catalysts. Now, Badger and Mobil back in the late 1970s started the zeolite revolution in ethylbenzene, and then in the mid-90s with Cumene, replacing older solid phosphoric acid processes and aluminum chloride processes with cleaner, higher yield zeolite processes. And those same upgrades are available today and in progress in a couple of projects here in Russia. So in summary, I'd like to just summarize and then pose a question. ExxonMobil is unique as a licensor in that we bring a lot of our own production experience and the manufacturer's perspective to the designs that we license. Safety, reliability, maintainability, and low cost, both in CapEx and OpEx. A lot of the technologies that I've talked about, both the old and the new, build on a rich legacy of both catalytic and process technology innovation, and we continue to do that. This area of refinery and chemicals integration is really important going forward because, as several of the speakers have identified, we won't be able to meet the world's needs just on the back of ethane cracked materials in North America. And therefore, refinery integration and refineries becoming chemical feedstock units is the way of the future as well in a blended economy. I've spoken about a couple of key enabling technologies. Some, like flexi-coking, have been in use and been continuously improved over 40 years of our own deployment. But more than that, we're committed to the long-term success of our customers. When we sign a license, it's not for this particular win or this particular deal only. It's more like a long-term marriage. So here's my question in summary and closing. It's how can ExxonMobil's catalyst and licensing business help you improve your petrochemicals complex configuration, utilizing some of our experiences of refinery and petrochemical operator for more than 100 years. Thank you very much. Spasiba.